Okay, fantastic. So we're gonna start the last part of the module of this term. And just to recapitulate, we did study the anatomy of the adrenal gland. We did study the classification of steroid hormones yesterday. We did a big overview on the hormone synthesis. I know these pathways were slightly complicated, but they will become second nature if you end up working with them. There were some main enzymes that you will need to learn, but are the ones that are associated with the disease conditions. We talk about the structures and biochemical properties of steroid hormones. And today, what we're going to talk about is the regulation of glucocorticoid secretion. So finally, we're going into the target organ. Okay? So this is now getting interesting because we're going to start learning what are the functions of the secondary and tertiary organs after there has been activation of glucocorticoid secretion. The class will be divided into two. One, the regulation of glucocorticoid secretion, and the second one, the regulation of mineralocorticoid secretion. Okay? Remember that the adrenal cortex secretes three types, okay? We said yesterday, of steroid hormones. Ones are glucocorticoids or cortisol, others are mineralocorticoids, and then also remember the androgens, okay? But the androgens, we will study them when we study the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, okay? So you'll see that the whole physiology will tie up together, okay? So, right, so now we can go even back at the beginning of our module almost. So regulation of the glucocorticoid secretion. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So just to recapitulate, we studied the hypothalamus. What does it secrete? Corticotroph releasing hormone. Corticotroph releasing hormone activates ACTH in the corticotroph cells of the anterior pituitary. I don't know if you remember, but we explained that this connection between the CRH and ACTH happens through a portal system of blood vessels with a plexus capillary that connects the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary. Then ACTH is expressed and secreted into the bloodstream. So what happens next is that ACTH targets the adrenal gland, in this case the adrenal cortex, and tells the pituitary to secrete cortisol. Cortisol will have lots of different functions, right? Such as stress response. We're going to study them today, but also has a feedback, negative feedback into the pituitary to tell pituitary stop secreting ACTH and into the hypothalamus to inhibit CRH. Okay? So, a little bit into the biology and physiology. So we know that the synthesis and secretion and actions of the mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids are controlled independently. Remember, there are mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Cortisol is the most potent glucocorticoid and is produced by the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis cells because they contain the enzymes that allow the modification of the cholesterol into the successive form of cortisol. Its secretion is regulated by adrenocorticotrophin hormone, or ACTH, which is expressed or secreted from the anterior pituitary. The secretion of ACTH is regulated by corticotrophin releasing hormone, which is in turn secreted from the hypothalamus. So what we end up is with a negative feedback loop. Hypothalamus activates anterior pituitary. CRH, or corticotrophin releasing hormone, activates adrenocorticotrophin hormone, and it produces cortisol in the adrenal gland. But more levels of cortisol in the blood inhibits the further secretion of CRH and ACTH. So what is interesting, like some of other hormones, is that the pattern of secretion of the follows a circadian rhythm. For example, now here in the UK is 7 a.m. So my cortisol level is up. Okay? In China, it's in the afternoon, so your cortisol level is lower, right? And it lowers during the day. Okay? So this is what is called pulsatile. So it peaks in early morning at the time of waking up, because cortisol is important in a stress situation or a response to a stimuli. So you need to wake up, you need to do a lot of things, you need to get your coffee, you need to take the public transport to get to the university, you need to attend the lecture. So it's like a wake up hormone, right? It's like you need, what does your body need to produce? Needs to produce glucose, needs faster circulation. So if you think about the physiology, it makes sense that we have a peak of cortisol in the morning, and then the lowest in the middle of the night. This pattern is related obviously to sleep and awake, and it can be very badly disrupted with working shifts in long and also in jet lag or long haul travels, because it goes with the daylight pattern. So cortisol, right, shows the same pattern, but the peak and nadir means the lowest level, occurs approximately 1 hour later than those of ACTH. So there is a slightly imbalance, right? It's not like you have more ACTH and 2 minutes later you have more cortisol. There is 1 hour between window between the increase of ACTH and the increase of cortisol. Secretion of ACTH is also raised at times prolonged stress. Let's say that, for example, you have final exams, your cortisol levels will be very high during the day also, and for weeks until the exams finish, because your body is in a stress response, okay? And as we will see, high increase of cortisol acts on the liver, on the production of glucagon, that increases hyperglycemia. Obviously, you want to increase glucose because glucose is what is important to give the energy in your metabolism. Okay? So, physiological actions of ACTH. The lecture yesterday was very biochemical, and the names are tricky. All these hydroxylases, carboxylases, but I mean, don't worry too much, okay? It's more about understanding the general functions rather than knowing all the enzymes one by one, okay? So the physiological actions of ACTH are two actions, okay? One acute, which basically stimulates steroid synthesis from the adrenal cortex. Okay? Remember, guys, what does it mean, steroid? Steroid hormone, it comes from cholesterol, so it's a lipid. Okay? And remember, lipids do not have a receptor in the cell membrane. Okay? They go through the membrane. It increases the blood flow to the adrenal gland. Then it also has lots of chronic actions, such as increase in adrenal weight, increase both cells numbers and size of the adrenal, and induces synthesis of enzymes involved in steroid synthesis. Okay? And obviously we're going to study what kind of enzymes involved in the steroid synthesis and which steroids are increased in this process. So, mechanisms of action of ACTH. Remember, we have here the cell, okay? Let me move the screen up here. And we have ACTH. ACTH binds to the receptor. We know that the receptor or ACTH is a G-coupled receptor, transforms ATP, increases cyclic AMP, activates protein kinase. At the same time, steroids, remember from the class yesterday, are from lipids, which are kept in lipid droplets inside of the cells, and they come from the LDL. Remember the video from yesterday that has a receptor, and basically it invaginates and forms these droplets. The cholesterol will go into the mitochondria, right? And obviously the mitochondria has two proteins which we studied yesterday, okay, for the protein to go, for the cholesterol to go in, right? Remember the transport protein and the star, okay? It makes it into the cholesterol. Then inside of the mitochondria, cholesterol is transferred to pregnenolone, okay? Then it will go outside, it will become 11-deoxycortisol, go back inside, cortisol, and then cortisol will be released. Let's look at it a little bit more in detail. So ACTH binds. What is the name of the binding site of ACTH? Is the melanocortin receptor, and the receptor is found in cell membranes in all the 3 layers of the adrenal gland: the zona glomerulosa, the zona reticularis, and the zona fasciculata. Okay? However, only the zona fasciculata and reticularis have the proper enzyme to modify the cholesterol into cortisol. And remember that this enzyme is the 17A hydroxylase. Okay? That's why the zona glomerulosa at the top of the gland does not produce cortisol. Okay? It will produce aldosterone because it does not have the right enzyme. I hope that this is clear. Okay? Then the receptor triggers cyclic AMP, activation of PKA pathway, and stimulates cortisol synthesis. Now, the mode of actions of the steroid hormones, right, or glucocorticoids, are slightly different to the ones that are receptor bound, membrane receptor bound. Why? Remember that steroid hormones are lipid, right? And therefore, they are hydrophobic, okay? But they can enter the cell without needing a receptor in the membrane. So they go inside of the cell and then they meet inside of the cell a receptor for this steroid hormone. This is an internal receptor that can be found either in the nucleus or either in the cytoplasm. Then this receptor co-binds to chaperones, okay, and the receptor complex between the steroid hormone and the receptor binds to the DNA, and in the DNA acts as a fast transcriptional activator and transcribes certain important genes. So, in common with all other steroid hormones, glucocorticoids produce their effect by an action of intracellular receptor mediated, okay, and alter the transcription factor by producing mRNA and then ribosomes and then a protein. This mechanism of action results in delay and obviously compared to ours instead of the other mechanisms that are receptor based. The ones that have a receptor in the membrane and the peptide bounds, let's for example say growth hormone releasing hormone binds to the growth hormone releasing hormone receptor. This is a very fast, okay, fast. It binds the receptor, it triggers a cascade. In this case, this steroid needs to go into the past the lipid, go inside of the cell, find the receptor, okay? So the mechanism of actions is always delayed when it comes to steroid because it's not membrane receptor bound action. There are two types of receptors of glucocorticoids. Type 1, which are called mineralocorticoid receptors, or we're going to refer as MR. Otherwise, or too long name, mineralocorticoid receptor, MR. And the other one is aldosterone receptor, okay? And type 2, glucocorticoid receptor, okay? So only 10% of the cortisol that is released within the blood is in a free active form. Only the free unbound form of cortisol is active. The remainder is bound to plasma protein, so it can travel also through the peripheral organs, and this is normally attached to plasma proteins which are called corticosteroid binding globulin or CBG, okay, or transcortin in 75% of the cases, and in albumin in 15% of the cases. The same protein also transports other glucocorticoids and progesterone. Now, what is the metabolism of the corticosteroids? And this is a very small summary. Okay, the metabolism of the adrenal steroids occurs mainly in the liver. And in the liver, they are glucocorinated to form water-soluble forms which are excreted into the urine. Okay? So we have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes the steroid secreting tissues. And within these steroid secreting tissues, remember we have several ones: progestogens, androgens, estrogens, corticoids, okay? they travel to the blood system and they activate biological active steroids and they target different organs. In the liver, we will see that they produce gluconeogenesis, right? And in the kidney, aldosterone produces the reabsorption of sodium, right? But then obviously this needs to go into the urine into a soluble form, okay? In the case of the liver, in the bile, gut, and into the feces. So more physiological actions and important actions of glucocorticoids. So there are metabolic, immunological, mainly immunosuppressive, and very important, anti-inflammatory. Also cardiovascular and psychological, and obviously stress. So let's have a look in the metabolic actions of the glucocorticoids. At normal physiological concentration, most important actions, where is my, okay, actions of cortisol are those of carbohydrate metabolism. Now remember from the biochemistry lectures that carbohydrate metabolism has to do with sugar, right? And the overall goal of the glucocorticoids is to impact different organs to create a level of hyperglycemia, so more sugars in the blood. How it does this? Influencing different organs, right? So glucocorticoids, right, in the pancreatic beta cells produce less insulin secretion, okay? So less insulin secretion means more sugar in the blood. But they also target the liver. So in the liver, they produce more gluconeogenesis. So it's the novel formation of glucagon. That glucagon then is converted into glucose, right? So this will increase the levels of glucose in the blood. Then also they work in insulin sensitivity, right? In the skeletal muscle, they reduce the glucose uptake, glycogen synthesis, and they increase proteolysis or breakdown of the proteins. And all these in the adipose tissue, they reduce the glucose uptake and they increase lipolysis. So what is the net effect is that it has an increased hyperglycemia. Also, if you remember the uh, episode or the pulsatile form of ACTH, in the morning you have increased ACTH, increased glucocorticoids, increased cortisol, but also you have increased hyperglycemia in the morning because it's a way of your body needs energy, okay, to start the day, to start going to the metro, to start going to the university, to start listening to the lectures, okay? So cortisol opposes insulin. You can say here insulin, more insulin, less glucose. So it has to oppose insulin. Antagonizes the effects of insulin on cellular uptake of glucose and stimulates glycogenesis in skeletal through catecholamines and stimulates hepatic glucogenesis, also cause hepatic glycogenesis, right? And gluconeogenesis is the effect of producing glucagon, which is a derivative of the glucose. So let's look a little bit more into the physiological actions of metabolic of glucocorticoids. Just forgive me 1 second. Sorry guys, I need the phone because I communicate with you with the phone. So, here is a very beautiful draw on all that we have studied up to now. Okay? So what happens here? Remember that the body is balanced and nature makes our body to be clock specific and very good homeostatic, right? So here we have the general vision of, I told you, hypothalamus integrates signals, right? Stress, daylight, circadian rhythms, okay? Then it will tell the neurons to produce CRH, which in turn will tell the anterior pituitary to produce ACTH, which in turn will produce the adrenal in the zona reticularis and fasciculata to produce high levels of cortisol, okay? And cortisol will impact in immune system, which will suppress the immunofunction, such as, for example, severe inflammation. Liver will produce gluconeogenesis. In the muscle, protein catabolism, and in the adipose tissue, lipolysis. So in the liver, cortisol stimulates amino acid uptake, leading to enhanced gluconeogenesis. I think that you have studied this in biochemistry, hopefully, right? So, in the periphery, it inhibits the amino acid uptake and protein synthesis, resulting in loss of skeletal protein. Cortisol stimulates lipolysis and mobilization of fatty acids, partially by potentiating the effect of growth hormone and catecholamines. Cortisol, when it's in excessive concentration, causes fat synthesis and deposition of novel fat in anatomical sites, such as the face or the trunk or intracapsular region of the shoulders. And this is very important, this part, in the diagnosis of Cushing's disease, which we will study further. Okay? So Cushing's disease is when the anterior pituitary produces a tumor that secretes ACTH, or a tumor in the adrenal cortex which produces too much cortisol. But we will study this in the next lectures. So going back to the actions, okay? So first one, immunosystem, okay? Which is the function of cortisol, right, in the immune system. So glucocorticoids affect the body's defense system in many different levels. They suppress lymphoid tissue and therefore reduce the antibody production and inhibit cellular immune system. So they can act as immunosuppressants. Okay? So if we look at the formation of inflammation, physiological, normally phosphatidylcholine, right, through this enzyme produces arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid by COX-2 enzyme produces thromboxanes and prostaglandins. And prostaglandins are very important in producing fever, but also acute site of inflammation. If you have a little injury or a cut or something, it activate this pathway. Phospholipase A will transform phosphatidylcholine into arachidonic acid, COX-2 increase, thromboxanes, prostaglandins, and then obviously massive inflammation. Now, a little bit of inflammation is good because that will recruit the immune system cells to attack the pathogens. But too much prolonged inflammation is not good because it can produce cancer, too much inflammation, but also can produce some chronic conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, and also it can produce like lots of skin conditions like eczema, psoriasis, and other inflammatory conditions of the skin, but also it can produce, for example, inflammation of the intestinal gut, and obviously that will produce abnormalities and other types of diseases. So some inflammation is good, but persistent inflammation is not good. Now, these glucocorticoids inhibit phospholipase A and COX-2 inhibition. Okay. Also, they inhibit the pathway at this level, leukotrienes, and basically they stop inflammation. But on top of this, they also affect macrophages. What are macrophages? Macrophages are the scavengers that attack and take out the negative tissue, right? And they go and produce inflammatory response. And they secrete interleukins, okay? And it's through the production of interleukins like interleukin 1 and the glucocorticoids stop macrophages from producing interleukins, and that obviously stops having fever, and obviously they stop also T cell activation and beta cell proliferation and antibody production. So they work as immune response. Okay. So we have tackled, if we go back, the immunoresponse and suppression of the glucocorticoids. Okay. So what happens on the cardiovascular and psychological actions of glucocorticoid? Another effect of excess of cortisol is enhanced vasoconstriction response to catecholamines, which result in increased blood pressure. Again, it's together with adrenaline, it works on the stress response systems. Glucocorticoids can also produce psychological effects with possible feeling of elation or sedation. So again, if we go into this little pathway, right? So stress, trauma, hypothalamus, production of CRH, anterior pituitary ACTH, adrenal, and cortisol negative feedback loop. There are many effects of glucocorticoids, but their most important role is in the response to stress. And in the absence of corticosteroids, even a mild stress can be fatal. What do we mean this? Is that if you don't have any corticosteroids, some little effects or trauma can be fatal to the organism. At times of psychological and psychological stress, such as trauma, infection, of hypoglycemia, there is a rapid secretion of ACTH and corticosteroids. This raises the concentration, additional effects of hormones that become apparent. Now, if we look a little bit more into the effects of glucocorticoids during injury, and in this table, right, what we have is that the overall effect is that individual is able to perform despite the presence of injury or infection. But we have separated here at times of injury and effect of the glucocorticoids. Pain alerts the sufferer to damage. Okay? Effect of glucocorticoids, steroids, induced sedation also causes lack of awareness of the severity of the situation. Eodema that dilutes and toxic substances that may be present in the immobilized and stabilizes joints. The adrenocortical stress response removes the pain and decreases immobilization induced by the eodema. Infiltration by leukocyte destroys and invading cells while antibodies inactivate foreign proteins. What is that doing, as I show you, is that the glucocorticoids decrease the immunoinflammatory response. Okay? So that's why, for example, in cases of acute inflammation or acute skin conditions or acute abnormal inflammatory process, glucocorticoids are given as a therapy. Tissue repair is enhanced by prostaglandins. The anti-inflammatory effect of glucocorticoids retard tissue repair. Okay? Mineralocorticoids actions of glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids, cortisol, are also able to stimulate aldosterone and mineralocorticoids receptors, MR. Okay? And however, aldosterone sensitive tissues, which are in the kidney, possesses the enzyme 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase or 11 beta HD2, which is the one that we studied yesterday. And this enzyme converts cortisol into cortisone, which is different. Okay? So obviously the cortisone will be inactive to bind the mineralocortical receptor. So the kidney transforms cortisol into cortisone, and cortisone will have other effects. Therefore, mineralocorticoid actions of glucocorticoids only apparent in high concentrations and in tissues as, for example, the liver, because the liver contains, right, the alpha 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which converts the cortisone into cortisol. So this enzyme is in the liver and will produce excess of cortisol. So this is just to see the two modes of action where kidney produces cortisone from cortisol and liver produces cortisone to cortisol. Now, remember this, it is a little bit complicated, okay? However, the ones that we have talked today is here the 11 beta hydroxylase that converts into cortisol, right? And also the one that converts into cortisone, right? And what we've done is that this happens in the zona fasciculata, but also it happens in the liver because it has the 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, okay, which is another enzyme to produce cortisol. You do not need to know all these enzymes. You will only need to know these enzymes for certain disease conditions, okay? But obviously you need to know that each zona fasciculata, zona reticularis, zona glomerulosa, right, produces certain derivates, and that obviously the zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids, which we will study, and glucocorticoids, the fasciculata, and androgens, which we will study the androgens at the end of the module in the reproduction, right? Because we will study the testosterone and also the other hormones. So Now we will have a break. Today is a lecture which is shorter because basically the diseases will be studied in the other part of the module, and in the second part of the class we're going to study the regulation of the mineralocorticoids, in fact the zona glomerulosa, the aldosterone. Okay, and with that we will finish. Okay, I know that the lectures today are going to be a little bit shorter, but that's okay. It's not about giving a lot of information, it's about giving just the right information that you need. So with this, okay, let me stop sharing the screen. Just 1 second. Stop the recording.